Welcome to the Research Hub event for Faculty for a Future. My name is James Dyke and I'm an academic lead at the Faculty for a Future project. I'm also an associate professor at the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. I'm going to be your host for today's event. Hopefully it's going to be a very interactive event. I'm sure we're going to have some really excellent discussions. Please follow us on Twitter. We are at faculty_future. And if you are tweeting about this morning's event, then please use the hashtag Research for a Future. So why we're here. I think you've got a rough idea of why we're here. I'm just going to give some very brief opening remarks to be able to set the scene, as it were. And I think that I'm here because there's been an increasing sense of awareness and understanding from me that I've become somewhat frustrated and concerned about my role in academia in the light of what you might want to call the climate and ecological crisis. So that was what motivated me to join Faculty for a Future, or help found Faculty for a Future. And that's certainly what continues to motivate my research as I continue to practice and what I attempt to do beyond my research. And so we have gathered a galaxy of stars today to talk about their experiences, their routes into this particular kind of space. Now, in order for us to help set the context for that, I'm going to introduce two wonderful people to you all. They're going to be Jordan Rain and Wolfgang Knorr. Jordan is, I think, our illustrious leader. I can't remember what Jordan's title is. CEO, Chief Executive, is something quite impressive. And then also Wolfgang Knorr, who is our academic lead for research and community practice and other fabulous things. And Wolfgang, how are you doing? Excellent.
Hello,
Right, okay.
Thanks so much.
You and your yurt
intro.
this morning, are you? In your tent or yurt?
Yeah.
All right. So I'm just going to hand the floor to you for a couple of minutes to give us a little bit of background about some of the research motivations, maybe even philosophy around Faculty for Future. So over to you two guys.
Okay. Let me just kick this off briefly. I just want to, basically, I just want to say a few words about how I came here. And I joined climate science in 1992, became a climate scientist, professional climate scientist. Stayed in climate science as an academic until the end of 2019, and then eventually pulled out of academia because I felt that as a climate scientist, I wasn't doing the right thing to address the interlocking crisis that humanity is facing now. And I actually moved into activism, and then the rest of the story is that I met Jordan and James and other people, and we all set up Faculty for Future. But here I'd like to talk a bit more about why. Sorry, I just wanted here to talk about why this happened. As a practicing climate scientist, I felt increasingly that what I was doing wasn't making things better, and in some way actually contributing to the crisis, making it worse. And I started my activism saying, basically, collectively as scientists, we've been letting down humanity. And the reason for doing this was that I felt that, we just kept on doing the same thing. The crisis was getting worse. Carbon dioxide levels were getting up and up. Species extinction was accelerating, and we just kept doing the same thing. So what we didn't do is we didn't embody the crisis. We didn't do what you do in emergency situations. So things are getting worse and worse, and we didn't embody it. So we communicated. Basically, it was okay. And the other thing that I felt very much is also that after almost 3 decades, I didn't have a good feel for how severe the crisis is, how dangerous things really are, because basically it all depends on the human factor. And that's the other thing that I felt was missing, is that we as scientists didn't connect with other people. We didn't connect with social scientists. We didn't connect with the actual people affected. And we also didn't share wisdom. We actually didn't admit how little we knew. and this whole situation basically, to me, amounted to a failure of building trust with the rest of humanity, in a way of letting them in and what we knew, and we basically failed at that. And this is what we want to do better.
So Jordan, can you introduce maybe the project, or maybe some of the hopes and aspirations around maybe today's event, but in the context of what Faculty for a Future hopes to do in the research space?
I'm not going to bang on too much at the start because there's plenty to chat about, and we'll go into more detail later. But really, I mean, where we are in terms of everything that we do at Faculty for a Future, it's coming in the context of a recognition that we are in a time of multiple converging environmental and social crises. And in academia, our best efforts to date haven't been able to stop these from advancing. So really the question that we're wanting to ask here is, what research is needed to change that story? In a nutshell, I think we feel that we need more new and more diverse and fair forms of research collaboration that understand the obstacles to transformation so far, and that include the wisdom of experience from communities and practitioners on the ground, and that can bring all of these types of expertise together in an equitable whole. We don't think that there's enough support out there at the moment to foster these kinds of collaborations, and so we're trying to see what we can do to provide more. So that's all I'll say for now. We'll cover this in more detail in the second half of the event, but I really just want to emphasize that a really big point of this event for us is to be open to ideas and constructive criticism and refinement. We want to engage as much as possible with the people that we're trying to serve. So we really encourage all of you watching to get involved and share your reflections and questions.
Thanks, Wolfgang and Jordan. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to bring in some panel members and have a discussion. And I think we've done a pretty good job of setting the scene. Just briefly, how I got to be here is that, well, I think the reason I'm here is because and we're talking about research today, is that I do think research is a tremendous privilege. It really is an amazing thing. You get paid to just sit around and think stuff up. Okay, that's not just the job of an academic. I'm not applying some kind of rose-tinted glasses to what higher education sector's like these days. There are many, many issues around it. But one of the real reasons that I am here is because there is a genuine passion and a love for finding things out. And I think it is an enormous privilege. But about 15 years ago, I suppose I came to the conclusion that I felt guilty about being able to have that privilege, whilst around me I could see there were things that were not going very well at all. So whilst my background was kind of earth sciences or physical sciences, I'm very interested in the changes of our home planet. And it's been a very long and erratic and very inefficient scramble to try to get to a place where I feel that somehow, either in my research practice directly or in my wider role as an academic and the things that I do outside of my day job, I could make some kind of contribution. I could feel like I was producing knowledge which was fit for purpose. Because what I didn't want to be is doomed to making ever more detailed descriptions of our home planet as it slides into chaos. So what's been amazing about the Faculty for a Future project is that we've been already connecting and finding inspirational people across the world who've actually been doing this, and they've been doing it for much, much longer than I've even been thinking about it. And we're very fortunate to have some of them here with us today. So we've got 3 people that have been able to join us today, and I'm extremely grateful for their time and energy already. The first person is joining us. It's Erica Thompson. Erica is a Senior Policy Fellow at the London School of Economics Data Science Institute. And Erica's work encompasses ethical and methodological questions about the development and use of models in a range of policy relevant contexts. So welcome, Erica. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
We also have Philippa Bayley. Philippa is a former manager of Bristol University's Cabot Institute that I know many of you will have heard of. But she's now a creative producer at Living Language Land, a co-produced global nature language project. Good morning, Philippa.
Good morning. Thanks, James.
And we also have Shibaji Bose, who is working as a consultant for a number of projects, I think. We came to Shibaji's work through the Tapestry project, which develops bottom-up approaches to exploring socially just and transdisciplinary pathways to sustainability in marginal environments, and that's in India and Bangladesh, I think, predominantly. Welcome, Shibaji.
Thank you, and it's really a pleasure to be, got sucked into this interesting conversation.
That's it. The problems you've all had is you answered an email from Jordan probably, and that's it. He lured you in. But thank you so much for finding the time to be with us here today. So the first question I've got to you, and I guess we'll just go round and I'll ask you all in turn, is how do you see what can be called the climate crisis or the social ecological crisis? I mean, what do you, in terms of your own maybe your own professional practice or wider life, how do you kind of see the crisis that we're trying to address? Because every time I ask this, I always get a different question. So I do love to begin with this one. So Erica, no pressure. What is the crisis that we're talking about today?
Sure. Well, I don't know. I mean, it feels to me like a crisis of everything, right? It's not just about climate. If we could click our fingers and have infinite clean energy tomorrow that was not producing any carbon dioxide and it wasn't polluting the atmosphere, we'd still have problems, right? So it feels to me that it's a crisis of how humans live on this planet and how we relate to this planet. And so actually everything is bound up in it. And maybe one thing that is coming to the fore very quickly is the climate crisis and biodiversity and all of that. And it's obviously, somewhat terrifying. But it feels to me that it's only a symptom of wider problems of, sustainability in the literal sense of how do we create a civilization that can live with this planet as if it intended to stick around.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Philippa?
Yeah, I mean, Erica's made a very eloquent expression there. And I think just to add a layer, I think what strikes me about this crisis or this time of crisis is the vast asymmetry in the way that we are contributing to it and experiencing it. And we tend to talk very generally about how the world is experiencing something. Actually, we really have to get down into the details of how people live and how their lives are impacted to understand how this crisis is unfolding. So I'm always, wary of stories that are too big, that don't encompass the gritty realities of different people's lives in different parts of the world. So, but I would add the layer of asymmetry onto what Erica said.
Okay, well, that's actually a very nice introduction to some of Shibaji's work, I think, because working with those kind of one of the things you do quite a lot is working with those sorts of marginal communities. So what's your take, Shibaji?
Yeah, it's a key threat to the sustainability of humankind. But at the same time, as my fellow panelists were saying, the knowledge about how deep it is and how the scale and what the impacts remains deeply uncertain. And especially at the local level, where we see uncertainties manifest themselves in highly variable ecological systems. So, but from our perspective, it is also an opportunity for bottom-up transformation, turning the crisis into something positive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think already we're beginning to see some interesting discussions around the idea that there's this. I have typically taken very top-down approach. I look at civilization like a planetary phenomena. I can't even see people, right? But then obviously when you're talking about sustainability practice and affecting change, it's got to be at the bottom, right? So at some point we all kind of meet in the middle. So the next brief question, so we're still in kind of introduction, icebreaker stage, is I mean, how did you get into this space? How did you get into this work? To Erica, what led you here?
Well, I mean, it's a long story. It's probably too long, but so I have a background in maths and physics, and I did a PhD at Imperial in climate modeling, essentially North Atlantic storms. Mm-hmm. And as part of that, I had the opportunity to go to Copenhagen and the climate summit there in 2009. And they said, "Oh, we'll pay for your flight." And I said, "I don't want to go on a plane." So I got the bus with Climate Camp instead. And I mean, that was just a fantastic experience. It was really interesting. It was invigorating. There was so much going on. I tried to get into the main event, but we spent about 10 hours queuing in the snow outside one day and then gave up for the rest of the time and went to the Klima Forum and all of the fringe events organized by civil society groups. And it was just fantastic. You know, the energy and the imagination that was happening outside the negotiating theatre was brilliant, where inside it, you know, you could see the same old people using the same words and talking the same, you know, just saying the same things they'd be saying forever and expecting this to result in something different. And then, of course, there was, you know, all of the kind of media hoo-ha about Copenhagen and how it had been a failure. And, you know, and obviously there are different narratives that you could play that into. But I sort of came away feeling sort of simultaneously really disappointed in the political process and the kind of official channels, you know, that clearly were not up to solving this problem, but also really excited by what was going on everywhere else, and thinking, well, you know, how can I then contribute more towards bringing these together a bit more? So, you know, like a couple of people have already said, I didn't want to be spending my time doing climate science, finding more, you know, more decimal places on what's going to happen, where it's just, you know, given the large uncertainties, it's just a mug's game. It's not going to get us anything. And so I sort of refocused my work around the study of mathematical models, because I think that actually it's easy for physical scientists to say, you know, oh, we're just doing the best science we can. And this is kind of the natural way that models are. But whereas if you're a social scientist, it's easy to see what the social and political and ethical content of your work is. And so what I've been trying to do is to look at mathematical models, including physical models, you know, including climate models, and say, well, what is the social and political and ethical content of these models? How could we do it better? How could we do it in a way that is more supportive of positive decision making? Rather than just do the same old things that we've done for the last 40 years, which has resulted in the situation that we find ourselves in. Mm-hmm. So I've been doing that, you know, and I'm not quite sure. I still feel a bit unsure about where I'm going with this and whether it's useful and which aspects of it are useful. You know, I've been writing a book, so I have a book. You probably can't see it, Escape from Model Land, which looks at some of these issues, and again, the social and political and ethical content of models in different domains. But I'm just really interested to kind of see, you know, who comes back to me and says, yes, this is true. You know, we can see the arguments on Twitter, for example, about the content of integrated assessment models and the ways that one might do that differently. I don't really quite know what I'm doing, to be honest. You know, I've found a really interesting niche of things that feel to me to be very related to the question of how to generate an alternative vision, how to kind of find a more imaginative way of thinking about this global crisis that we face, and with all of its interconnected facets. But I'm not quite sure where it's going next. So that's where I find myself now. That's where I've come from.
That's awesome. It also sounds quite familiar as well. Basically, you're kind of like throwing things out there, and you never know what comes back. So I think, you know, I'm going to bring in Jordan and Wolfgang in a moment, but I think that's certainly one of the motivations, is that we will try and connect people who want to provide something or talk to people to understand actually what would be useful, right? So how about you, Philippa?
Yeah, I really love what Erica said there about sort of generating an alternative vision. And I think that's been sort of my route through science, but from a completely different starting point. So my PhD is in developmental neuroscience. So how tiny organisms build a brain. And I guess what's always motivated me about that is it's a very beautiful process. And I think, you know, my work over many years now or finding my way over many years is what I'm trying to say, is about kind of revealing that beauty and the beauty inherent in the natural world, and speaking more to the emotional side, in a sense. You know, one of the most beautiful experiences of my life was, turning the objective lens on the microscope and seeing growth cones, which are part of how neurons connect with each other, developing in a frog and a fish embryo. It's just a remarkable thing to see, and life is so remarkable. So I think that's what's kind of guided my work. I, as you said, James, in your introduction, managed the Cabot Institute at the University of Bristol for 5 years. But now my work is much more about trying to speak to that emotional connection that we have with our living planet, and that sense of belonging, very much kind of echoing the work of the author Robin Wall Kimmerer. If you have come across her, she's an ecologist, but also a Native American woman, and she fuses her indigenous wisdom with her scientific training, and comes forward with a very different worldview. So that idea of how do we see this crisis from a different place? How do we see the resources that we have both within us and collectively in a different way? That's sort of what motivates my work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I haven't read that, and also Erica, you like as a novel. Right, okay. Apparently, Erica, once you've written a book, it should be in your bookcase, turned out, so every time you do a call, you can see the book.
Well,
yeah, like that, like
Yeah.
that book. I think it was an E.O. Wilson book or something. I can't remember which one it was, where he describes the first time he was doing research in the tropics, and he came across a wolf spider, a little jumping spider, and looking into its eyes, and he's describing the forest and just the extraordinarily complex ecosystem it was in, and it's all just beauty. It's all the language of beauty, and he's obviously he's a world-leading scientist, but that was one of the books that kind of got me hooked, right? It's that very emotional kind of connection.
Yeah, and I think, just to follow up on that, James, I think that's something that we need to talk to researchers about, is what is that core motivation? What were those moments that made you think, actually, I want to devote my life to understanding more about how the world works, and, on a physical, on a chemical, social, whatever level, and to tap in that's an incredibly powerful motivator of action. It's why we take so many of the actions that we do in the world is for the love of things, and I think we don't talk about that enough in research in terms of what motivates people.
Yeah, that's really important. Okay, Shibaji, how about you?
Yeah, so I was also thinking and reflecting. So my background is in health systems. So after spending a decade in health systems, it's about all the risks and insurance. But I realized that nothing is very systemic in the health systems. They always think about the plugs and pulls of the health system and etc. And it's very well documented and showed to us during the COVID pandemic. So, and I was doing this in, places, working on the health systems in places which are climate frontiers, like the hotspots of Sundarbans and then the Kutch. And so these are where, the climate change was itself a factor. It was supposed to be a background, but it was the, determining factor. And all we were doing was to, control uncertainty. And taking out models to control uncertainty. And somewhere I felt, while doing this uptake for evidence and all that we are not actually talking to the people who matter, who actually bear this uncertainty and have the daily have to deal with it on a daily basis. So there are big killers which we find in the media, like cyclones and tornadoes and typhoons. But there are also silent killers like floods and embankments breaching. So I thought about and also the interaction between the explicit knowledge and the implicit knowledge, which should be the knowledge actually to deal with in the places across the globe. So that's what's missing. So in this, while coming into climate change, so I actually is focusing on democratizing the spaces, so that I don't know what it will turn out to be, or the status quo will be maintained, but actually having and facilitating and working together to give voices to the people who actually matter and who actually gets infected and affected.
Yeah, that's really important, and you've done a really good job, because you've just linked into my next question. So well done, everyone. Because one of the key objectives of the Think Faculty for a Future is that co-production or co-creation. Certainly my experience of quite a lot of the climate or sustainability or environmental crisis research does feel a bit like, okay, I have generated knowledge, I'm going to throw it over the wall, and then society is going to, right? Now, there's a number of reasons why that's not a particularly effective model, is because it's not, the issue is not an information deficit. It's not that society doesn't understand there's a big problem. It's because we're working within a maelstrom of politics and economics and all these kind of factors, of which information is just like a tiny bit. And so in our experiences of working either in co-production, co-creation spaces, or what we see in other co-production projects, it seems really, really empowering. It seems really, really exciting, right? So where's your thinking? Actually, if I could, I'll put this one to you first, Shibaji, because I think you've got most perhaps experience on this, right? How would you motivate, or maybe how would you explain why co-production is important, right? And you could maybe also, together, we might want to think about, have there been examples or experiences where we can see it's been missing, you know, or how the inclusion of co-production could have really helped in previous projects or efforts to address the crisis? What do you think, Shibaji?
Yeah, so co-production is, you know, we talk about co-production, but it should have been like this from the beginning. So it is so if when you go and research on a person, so you are researching, you should actually be researching with the person, you know, so, you know, and also because of this implicit and explicit narratives, and so, and I've been thinking more on the framings of how the framing is developed. That is one thing. And co-production, let me think about it, and I will get back to you, you know, after others. It's, you know.
No worries. Okay.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that, Philippa?
Yeah, I mean, co-produced research is I think, you know, as Shibaji says, it's the way it should be done. You know, if you're familiar with the disability rights slogan, you know, nothing about us without us. It's that people are not there as experimental subjects wandering around in order to have their lives interrogated by other people with different ideas. And I guess to me, the problem is inherently is that you often ask the wrong questions because you come with a frame from your, you know, your place of origin, your culture, your situation, that makes a certain thing interesting to you that may not be at all relevant to the people on the ground. And also, I mean, the flow, how the benefits flow back to the communities that have supported the research endeavor is a really important issue. I mean, again, to sort of reprise that kind of thought about asymmetry, I think it is very, very difficult in the situation we're in at the moment, where the vast majority of research funding is concentrated in the global north, and very little of that is devoted towards creating equal research partnerships with people across the globe. I mean, I was just looking at, you know, the UKRI research budget is the same as the GDP of Haiti, for example, £8.8 billion a year. And if you look at the Horizon Europe funding, you know, across the whole EU, you know, that's 95.5 billion euros, which is the same as the GDP of Cuba or something. So these are enormous forces that we are working within. We're working within an industry that is essentially a global north industry. And I think we do have to think about it like that in order to think, how do we want to participate in this? Because if we were working for Coca-Cola and they were extracting water from precious aquifers in Africa, you know, we would have thoughts about that. But in a sense, we are also working in an extractive industry in research, and we have to think about it like that, even though at the level of the individual experience, it's always a scrabble for, will I get the grant, and, you know, competing and you know, almost like a just breadcrumb like existence of, can I get to the next, you know, to the next little pot of money. So I think, you know, I think co-production is incredibly important. I know of many research projects that involve co-production in brilliant ways in the Cabot Institute and across the University of Bristol. Actually, it's a very strong part of the research culture there. but it has to be more widely endorsed. It has to become the norm. And there are so many things that have been normalized within our research processes, you know, from everything like the way that we name species across the planet, you know, which has absolutely nothing to do with the way that the communities who live with those species might have encountered them or know about them, you know, to the way that research is funded, as I say, to the way that publications are generated and supported. You know, we've got this massively unequal playing field. So yeah, that's very, very challenging to address. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it is. It's awesome. And what's really interesting is that in certainly some of the discussions that I've been having, I find people or groups, maybe even small working groups within a university that's trying to address some of these real institutional, systemic, historical legacy issues with academia, certainly as it's practiced by affluent global north Western institutions, tremendously powerful institutions. But they still remain the minority, sometimes the tiny minority. And when you talk about, or when you ask people to reflect on these issues, it's like, well, they literally have never thought about it before, right? Yeah. Certainly from a scientific context and framing. So this is the question I want to ask you, Erica, is that how does that sit with notions of, you know, the supposed model of objectivity and that view from nowhere, which we as good natural scientists should adopt? And so almost the last thing you would want to do is actually talk to human beings and co-produce, because we've got to be almost outside of the system in which we're observing. So have you navigated that space?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. And I mean, just to say, I really resonate with everything that Philippa said, and maybe to go a bit further, that, you know, academia is not just a global north thing. It's also very much for the wealthy and privileged within the global north. You know, the representativeness, even within our societies of academia, is just terrible. And so what that leads to are blind spots. It leads to, as you say, James, people looking at this and not even considering that there could be another way of seeing things, or that there could be another way of doing things. And so, you know, that then becomes embedded in the way that we do science. It becomes embedded in our models. It influences, you know, the starting point for all of these models. Like, why do climate models start with the physics of the fluids of the atmosphere and ocean? And they have biodiversity somewhere a long way down the line as just a kind of parameterized little thing. You know, we don't quite understand it, so we're just going to sort of stick it in as a little add-on at the end. Well, why don't we do it the other way around? Why don't we have climate models that start with the ecological system, and then they parameterize the fluids of the atmosphere somewhere? You know, that would look different. I mean, and you could imagine much more different ways of starting and thinking about these things. And yet we have this sort of, you know, very one-sided cultural, you know, sort of culture of academia and research, which fixates on one particular way of doing something and then doesn't consider that there could be other options. And I suppose the argument of my book is that leads us to really underestimate uncertainty, because we come at it from one perspective. We generate an extremely limited set of models. We can't conceive of there being any other possibilities. And then we try to draw a probability distribution from the models that we have, as if we were throwing darts at a dartboard. And it's completely ridiculous. You know, we don't need to know that all of the models that we generate from our very limited standpoint produce the same answer. What we need to know is that no other model could generate a different answer. And so I'm coming back to answering your question, because when you reframe it that way, no other plausible model could give a different answer, then you realize that, you know, they're sort of logically equivalent. That is the stronger scientific framing of the question. But the word plausible is doing a great deal of work there, right? So now we say, well, what is a plausible model? And that depends on who you are and what your background is, and whether you're a physicist or a biologist or a statistician or something else, you know. And so when we reframe it that way, it's clear that that we need to be pushing at the boundaries of what models can do, and you know, and thereby increasing the diversity of our models. But also, in order to do that, the only possible way to do that is by increasing the diversity of modelers, the people that are doing the modeling, and the perspectives that they bring, and the assumptions that they bring, the ethical and moral judgments that they will sort of unwittingly embed in their models. And so like you were saying about objectivity, you know, I think that actually what we have is a very non-objective conception of science at the moment, because we are going for this, you know, this idea of, you know, maths and physics basically being at the top of the hierarchy, and everything else, you know, then there's chemistry and biology, and a long way down there are sort of indigenous sciences, indigenous knowledge. And what I think we need to do in order to have a statistically valid and genuinely objective science that incorporates mathematical models is to put all of those back up onto the same footing and say, well, we need this standpoint diversity in order to achieve what Sandra Harding would call strong objectivity. We need to bring all these together in order to be able to do a statistical analysis, right? So for the physicists and mathematicians listening, you know, this is not second order. This is not fluffy and wishy-washy. This is not even saying that people need to be, you know, that we need to have diversity for its own sake, which we do, because it's important. You know, this is saying that we need diversity because it gives us a better answer. We can do better science. So yes, I think you put your finger on it there, James. It's absolutely these ideas of what objectivity is, and what science is, and what science ought to be, and what science can do for us, and what the function of science in society is. I think these are incredibly important questions that ought to be shaking the way we think about science and research. Yeah.
Sorry, I did the unmute thing. Sorry, what an amateur. So Shibaji, we've got a question in from the audience. They are there, and also I think it's going to follow on from just what Erica's been talking about, and further discussions about what goes into a model, right? How do we conceptualize the problem, and that is around co-production. But one of the questions that we've had is not everybody knows what co-production is. I mean, look, as academics, we're hopeless at using acronyms and terms and language that people just don't actually understand, or not entirely sure how they are best defined. So the question that we've got in is that, I'll just read it out for everyone. As this is a complex interacting issue across many areas, how can we bring people in to the research done and what we do not know without making think it's impossible to give up? Right? They'll just, okay, it's just, if I include everything, I just make an incredibly complex problem, and then it becomes impractical. Somehow we're talking about co-production as being a useful, or maybe even a necessary component into that. So I've got two questions for you, Shibaji. I'm going to make it work now. The first one is, how would you explain co-production, right? And then how can we use that along with other kind of methods to try to bring people in, try to connect people to what seems to be a whole series of intractable messes in a way which ultimately would empower them, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you, Philippa and Erica. Actually, you know, helped me to focus more on what actually co-production is. You know, so the first thing that, as we see in the projects which are actually, you know, have a sincere intent of co-production, it's number one, it's interdisciplinary. So you have got an arts component, a creative component, social science component, and natural science component, so that these knowledges are, you know, corroborated, and so we can triangulate the knowledge. So, and then at the local level, you have the stakeholders, the NGOs, the civil society, which is very important with, you know, a lot of right-wing, you know, emphasis nowadays. So they are very important as a alt voice, which can actually share research in very simple terms and the sustainability quotient. But what is, I think, is also something that I found is to actually to sketch the issues of vivencial lived experiences, you know, representing the climate change, and that should be told in a very, you know, original and an idealistic form, tells from the vantage point of the women, the children, the youth. So if the research methods which are embedded with the community, so we are creating actually a space where the explicit dialogue of the modelers, the scientists, and the researchers perhaps can be the facilitators in this process, and they can sit together with the implicit narrative and the dialogue. So, and what co-production also means we are able to imbibe into the research the everyday experiences experienced in the lives of the communities that are witnessing climate uncertainty. And most importantly, it's trying to reverse the gaze. We always look at it through our gaze and see through the lens of communities about their social processes of their lives and livelihood and their relationship with nature, the commons, the quotients that are political quotients and the economics processes. So I think these stories, along with the research, will seek to raise critical questions and to build new knowledge, and also to provoke questions on reimagination of a future landscape of equity, justice, and transformation.
James, you're muted again.
I'm hopeless at this. So would one way to explain co-production, it's sort of like the transformation of doing research not on people but with people. So you actually you're generating the knowledge with people rather than using them as kind of sources for data.
Yes.
What Philippa was talking about, the very traditional
absolutely.
extractivist model, where we will literally fly to some place, we will use people to get the knowledge or get access to data, whether it's tree rings or maybe even observational data about them, and then we will just literally take that and then fly away and write up in a nice journal which gets published behind a paywall. So have you got any so I mentioned the tapestry project when I was introducing you. Have you got any kind of experiences from that project, or maybe other projects that you think would be either good examples of how this kind of approach was used, or how you brought in people that perhaps previously hadn't undertaken that kind of research, or maybe even just some frustrations? I can't imagine this was all plain sailing. There must have been some experiences that were quite frustrating at times.
Yes. Yeah. So in the tapestry project, and also in another project on Anticipate, where the climate change has meant that a lot of places like the dry lands are experiencing the droughts as well as the floods, and it's very extreme changes at the same landscape simultaneously. So we were experimenting with a method called photo voice, which is in very simple terms is giving the camera to the women and tell them to click what they find important in terms of climate change and what touches their lives. And so actually we're trying to reverse the gaze, seeing their worldview, seeing their experiences, how they deal with it, because they're the ones who deal with it. We go in and go out, come out. So I will just give one example of a woman in Sundarbans. So she clicked a cow as as a manifestation of climate change devastation. And that woman was, also the lady was, catching any instrument, electrical instrument for the first time. So it was shaking and all that. And so she said that for me, the cow is important because when it gets flooded and we do not have any relief or any response for the first 3 days, that cow gives milk to my grandchild, which, is nutritious, and she is the most important animal to me. So those kind of reflections are about, about what we talk about, big things, about big modelings. At the same time, they are something that needs to be also addressed and be juxtaposed with the experiences, lived experiences of everyday existence. And yeah.
Okay, that's great. Many thanks.
Yeah, James, can I add something to what
sure,
Shibaji is saying there? Because I think you asked a question about sort of you know, does it all just get so complicated and intractable and kind of all lumped together? And I think it's really important to say we're not thinking about some kind of co-produced mega project. You know, I think just, you know, as Erica was talking about, what we need is a diversity of approaches to widen the field, and then we can kind of look, you know, that our field is not being disrupted enough by those different sort of edge cases or edge, you know, different explorations, I guess, that might be generated from a co-produced method. Co-production is slow and really challenging to do and to do well. And so it isn't something that you can kind of throw, you know, 100 million quid at and make it happen. It's lots of small projects based around the relationships that people already have or that they understand, or, you know, communities that they're interested in and that are interested in them. It's a very different model of the sort of big scale research, and sort of the antithesis of like the Large Hadron Collider and the kind of, you know, space telescopes, which are wonderful projects in their own right, but just it's completely opposite from that. Yeah.
Okay, so we got the next question in, and I'm gonna actually direct that to you then, if that's okay, because I think it is quite related. And this question, this is one I've asked myself actually. Is the job of research in this area, however we define it, to give more information, clearer information, to persuade the public or governments, or to find clear and practical solutions, which will have more impact? So Philippa, what do you...
Well, again, I think there's not a one size fits all answer. I think, you know, it's important that people play to their strengths. It's important that people broaden their skills and their approaches to doing research so that they're better resourced to make choices, so that they're not just doing what they do because that's the only thing that they can do. And that they, you know, as Erica's talked about really eloquently, start to see their the standpoint that they're bringing into their research and how they might want to flex and move that. I personally think, you know, the impact agenda has been an important shift in the way that UK research happens, in asking people to articulate what is going to be the impact of your research and how are you going to make that happen. I think it's that pathways to impact is really important. You know, have you thought about the people that you want to connect with? And that's still a step away from co-production, but at least it gets people to think about their research within that wider context. You know, there isn't one way that's going to work for everybody. But I think what we have to make sure is that we're all pushing in the same direction, if you like, you know, so whether you're talking to policymakers, whether you're going into schools, whether you're, you know, engaging with industry, whether you're working with community groups, that it's about, yeah, validating those different points of view and trying to find the places where we can work together constructively. And as Erica said, to kind of, you know, to level the playing field so that people feel that their voices matter in the research process.
So our first panelist is Paul Chatterton. He is a writer, researcher and campaigner. He's a professor of urban futures in the School of Geography and currently the director of the university's Sustainable Cities Group. Paul is also the co-founder and resident of the award-winning low-impact housing cooperative Lilac and helped set up Leeds community homes to promote community-led housing. His recent books include Low Impact Living and Unlocking Sustainable Cities. And I have just learned he has a new book due to be published later this year, How to Save the City. Welcome, Paul.
Hey, James, thanks for having me. Great to be here, thanks.
Thanks for coming along. Okay, our next panelist is Sarri Bater. Sarri is a scholar practitioner with decades of experience in conflict transformation. Her practice goes beyond political and technical engagement with conflict to include deeper spiritual and philosophical resources for moving from paradigms of violence to paradigms of peace. Sarri's got a passion for the relationship between personal transformation and transforming systems and structural violence. She also specializes in identity and difference conflict. Hello, Sarri.
Hello, very nice to be here. Thank you so much.
That's awesome. And our final panelist today is Bob Watson. So Bob, he's a British chemist who did pioneering research on, amongst other things, ozone depletion and global warming back from the 1980s. Bob was the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from 1997 to 2002. He's helped lead other organizations such as the United Nations Environment Programme, World Meteorological Organization, and since 2016, Bob, amongst many other duties and responsibilities, has served as the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So many thanks for joining us today, Bob.
Hi.
Okay, so we've got lots and lots of questions, and what I'll probably do is I'll just put a couple of questions to each of you, and then we'll just see how the discussion goes. And whilst we get questions from the audience, then I'll begin to feed these in also. So the first one, kind of the opening question that I like to ask this to everyone, is one of the assumptions of Faculty for a Future is that academia needs to do more in the light of the crisis. And of course, you ask what the crisis is, you'll get as many different answers as you ask as many different people. So I'm interested to know what is this crisis, or what's your view of the crisis, the area that you're working within? So if I may, I'll put that to you first, Paul.
Great, thanks. For me, it's a triple crisis. Yeah, ecological, climate, and social. But you know, here's the interesting nuance and I think what I'd like to pick up in threads later is that, you know, in the Northern Hemisphere, there's been a lot of discussion about emergency, right? We've gone on an emergency footing, and I think we need to put that emergency in its social context, that, like, I think the university and researchers have been not ignoring, but like not prioritising the broader social and economic emergency that's led to the climate and ecological emergency, So I think we've rushed into the new kid on the block is the climate emergency, and everyone's like, right, we've got to bring carbon emissions down. But the whole, and that's what my main narrative is, the whole university project, right, over the last 40 years has become lockstep with the broader neoliberal growth project. And that is what is driving the problem, And we've all benefited from this booming in university, especially in the Northern Hemisphere here in the UK where I am. So we benefit from this big Blairite expansion of universities. And what I can explore later is how that then became lockstep with this property-led growth model leading to higher land values, increasing social inequalities, and paradoxically higher carbon emissions.
Okay, that's obviously, depending on who you talk to and maybe when you talk to them, like, is it before the pub in the conference or after the conference in the pub, you'll get various levels of agreement or maybe even disagreement. So, I mean, Bob, to what extent does that chime in the context of there has been quite a close relationship between academia and the development of knowledge, which is coming out of academia, and maybe, some sorts of ways in which that knowledge is used in particular kind of social or economic contexts? I mean, for example, if I was to put that question to somebody, a natural scientist, I think a defensible response would be, well, that doesn't seem to be the case at all, right? I mean, science is just objective. Science is just whatever we do. We can consider science almost divorced of any kind of social or like political lens. So what do you make of these kind of comments?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is we clearly have a crisis that most people view as environmental: climate change, loss of biodiversity, land degradation, pollution. First thing to note is all of these issues are interrelated. We can't look at them one at a time, they're interrelated, but they're not just environmental issues. They're development, economic, social, moral, and ethic and security issues. And therefore we can't actually, and we live in an equitable world where environmental degradation hurts everybody, but hurts the poor most. Now, from my perspective, we have got some very good systems to link academia with science and policy processes on climate, biodiversity, and the stratospheric ozone, international assessments. But what's really needed is to complement the international assessments, of which I've shared all of them at one stage or another, to national assessments and even subnational assessments. In other words, to deal with issues like the impact of climate change, or how do you conserve and restore biodiversity, the actions have to be at the local level. We know enough to set global goals. There's enough information to set global goals on climate change, on biodiversity, on pollution. But to enact it at the local level, we have to engage scientists with people that act at the local level. Now, let's be quite honest. At the international level, as I've already said, we have enough knowledge to act. Unfortunately, the problem is not the scientists. The problem is governments and large-scale industry, on balance, aren't willing to take the actions that we have already identified as scientists that are needed on climate, biodiversity, etc. So we've got some good structures in place, but they need to be complemented.
Okay, thanks. And Sarri, what's your take?
Yeah, thank you. I'm building on what's already been said. For me, it's really important to acknowledge that if we are really starting from the assumption that, you know, this just is scientific, what we're actually doing is we're functioning and consciously operating in some kind of power blindness. There's an assumption there that this is happening some kind of neutrality, without actually the kinds of power structures that are in play on in Paul's words, the neoliberal, I might use the word neo-colonial power structures, and to act without engaging with that under the misunderstanding that we're in neutrality when we act is absolutely participating in the norms of these oppressive ways of doing things that hold power in certain places and hold resources in certain places and have been built to do so. They're not happening by accident. And so even just the very idea of seeing in the last, I don't know, even in the last 5 years, for example, seeing more and more, for people who would maybe not be normally engaged in these areas, but seeing more and more narrative and protests and you know, actions around the climate emergency and calls to action, that is a whole set of discounting, continually discounting, that actually some people have been living in this crisis for many years, which is a crisis of colonialism and all the ingredients of colonialism and oppression that comes with that. So that very separation is actually participating in continued discounting of parts of the crises that people are living with every day, including in the Northern Hemisphere, actually, but obviously in the global South as well.
Yeah. So I think, if I may, so when Bob is talking about in the context of global science, there is sufficient information, right? So we've known, in terms of the broad strokes of the climate crisis, we've known for a very long time what the drivers and what the ultimate solutions. But of course, when you're looking at decision making, when you're looking at how things happen, there is no global governance structure. It's all about national political systems and infrastructure. It's all about subnational, regional. It's about messy local politics. It's all ultimately, is it? So I'm just going to get back to you on this issue, Sarri. Is it ultimately a kind of form of conflict that needs to be resolved?
I think that is definitely one word we could use for it, for sure. For me, this is, in my field, as someone coming from a conflict and peace building approach, I would absolutely talk about systems of restoring and healing as part of the research that we do, as part of the policy that we form, as part of our, I loved the phrase that was used earlier, the embodying, I think that was by Tom? Sorry, I forget. The embodying of what it is that we're actually trying to bring, the values that we're trying to bring. in the ways that we engage for it to be transformative? How can we hold this conflict, these divisions, in a restorative way? And I absolutely believe it's possible to do. We don't have to be a conflict specialist, and we don't have to be funded to do conflict work to be embodying those kinds of ways of restoring and reunifying when we do our environmental research and our environmental policy making and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm still quite new to this space, I must admit. You know, I'm learning an awful lot every day, and it's not that long ago when I first encountered some of these kind of discussions or some of the debate, and it did strike me as initially quite strange and actually quite unsettling, because there I am thinking I'm a scientist and I can take, if not an objective view from nowhere, then at least I can take myself out of this mess, right? And I can do my science. And there might be increasing frustration, people not listening to the science or interpreting it in different ways, or maybe, you know, misusing it. And I'm not completely naive that there are, you know, politics of delay and vested interest, but to get more embedded in the space in which somehow I'm a part of the problem is a strange and unsettling kind of space to be. So I want to ask Paul, I mean, I think this is more of your, in terms of your academic practice, perhaps more of your day job. Would that be right? I mean, this is more the kind of space that you occupy on a regular basis. And is it a space you've always been in, or has this been a journey that you've taken too?
I think more and more what I do is kind of almost like engage with policymakers, maybe take them to task a little bit. And it's what the World Health Organization calls the no-do gap, yeah? This massive yawning chasm between evidence and action, you know, the stuff that Bob's been working on for decades, right? That, like, we kind of know enough. We know we've got to rapidly build a, you know, 1.5 degree society, compliant with 1.5 degree target. And, you know, IPCC's run out of adjectives, right, to describe that. It's rapid, transformative, large scale. It just goes on. You're like, well, what can you say next? So really the job is, you know, in essence, remember, universities have very local roots, right? Hanging out with local industrialists, merchants, you know, applying sort of local industry. And many of them at those roots 150 years ago. And I think getting back to those local roots is important. Local, and how can they develop a theory of change and action, right? Where we're going to radically change localities and reach city regions, yeah, based on a particular development model, which a lot of it's around donut economics, right? That safe and just operating space for humanity, you know, Kate Rouse approach. Around how can we live well within limits? How can you take a city region which the university is located in and its national sphere and start a proper policy debate? Because remember, universities are very influential in their localities with local and regional policymakers and as development actors. How can they start to unpack that local development process and say, what does living locally here mean in terms of living within biospheric Earth system limits, right? And that's what the scientists can tell us. But living within the social foundation, so people have the basics of life, yeah? And we have all the knowledge in the university to do that, but what we can explore more later is, you know, how the research process and the property development process of universities isn't geared towards those challenges. The research councils, UKRI, is still, I mean, it's around the edges, it's fine. We can all find little avenues for grants here and there, but it's still focused on UK PLC, increasing national productivity. It's the classic, as Boris is calling it now, it's cakeism, you know, with cakeism all over the place. We cannot have our cake and eat it. We cannot say the focus of the university is to support growth in national productivity and tackle the biggest existential emergency of our time. Yeah, we have to unravel those fundamental contradictions and take them to the vice chancellors, take them to people who run the research councils, and are distributing the money on that basis. Yeah.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about how we can leverage the maximum amount of not just impact but good from our research, because the research I think we're all doing is research that's motivated by the crisis. We're trying to use our academic practice to do something constructive, and an important way in which we do that is working with others. So sometimes it's called co-production. It's working with different organizations, different stakeholders, different communities to better understand what the crisis is from their perspective, to better understand what generating knowledge in that context looks like. So Bob, in that respect, you've got some pretty unique insights of working at particular kind of layers. So you mentioned kind of national governments, and my assumption is that there's decades of intense frustration about, trying to get national governments or national bodies and national organizations to act in commensurate sense of urgency, given what the science is saying. So what's been your, what can you say about that? What can you speak to about that working in relationships with, in co-production with these kind of national or large organizations, or sometimes international, of course?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is almost going back to an earlier comment. Sorry, we do need to understand power structures at all levels. We have to understand at the international level the role of governments as they interact with each other. Because if we're going to deal with big issues like climate change, loss of biodiversity, these are issues of the global commons, and you do need coordination across governments. No single government can deal with issues alone. Also have to deal with issues of the global commons or global concern, biodiversity. So while they need action at the local level, things that happen at the local level also affect the globe. So one understands power structures both at the global level, the national level, and the subnational. That means you've got to bring in all stakeholders, not just governments, bring in the private sector, all parts of civil society, NGOs, etc., national and international organizations. So unless you understand the power structure, and so when I've chaired international assessments, I've dealt with it at a global level, ministers of environment, ministers of energy that want to understand how we deal. But then I've also had positions in the White House as a deputy science advisor to the president. I've been a science advisor in the World Bank and in DEFRA, the UK Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. There, one was actually working at the national level, but also it was crucial to work with the stakeholders, the private sector, the NGOs at the national level, but also, of course, the different parts of the scientific community, including in the UK, of course, the Royal Society. So unless one actually gets to grips with what is the problem and who needs to be part of the solution, is absolutely crucial. And therefore, more transdisciplinary research where you actually co-design the research. You ask each of the stakeholders, whether it's the government or the private sector, from their perspective of climate or biodiversity or pollution, what are the issues from your perspective? Then the scientific community can actually help to co-design projects, co-produce the knowledge, and then co-communicate the knowledge. And you need to be part of all three levels. And if you can then work with the stakeholder that matters, it can make a big difference. So for example, when I was the program manager for stratospheric ozone in NASA back in the early 1980s, I put some projects together with the private sector. And people will say, why would you want to work with the private sector? That we actually co-funded projects, and they bought into this was a serious issue. So we got DuPont, ICI, Montiflorus, and another 16 companies to recognize how serious the issue of stratospheric ozone is, because we embroiled them in the research and we embroiled them in the international assessment process. So by working with that private sector with some very strict criteria, totally the opposite of the tobacco fiasco, totally opposite. By working with those stakeholders, we managed to turn a whole industry around. It took a number of years, but by engaging them, really made a difference. And then you can take that example down to the local level. Paul obviously works with the local city council, which you have to do if you want to do urban planning. So I think in each case, when you decide what is your problem you're trying to fix, whether it's a very local issue or a global issue, the key is identifying all relevant stakeholders and working with them. And when I use the word science, it brings all of science. It's natural science, engineering, law, business, humanities, social science. And the point we have to, as scientists, understand, knowledge is a necessary condition for evidence-based policy, but it's not sufficient. Having worked in the White House, having worked in the senior part of the British government, there are lots of factors that come into different decisions.
Yeah, that speaks to some of the kind of the political tides or forces that Paul mentioned at the start here. I wanted to bring Sarri in because we've mentioned stakeholders quite a lot and co-production quite a lot, and we want to involve, and the motivation is to make the tent bigger and bigger. Of course, when you do that, you're going to increase the potential for conflict because you're going to get more and more people with more and more different views. How in some of your previous work and projects, how do you ensure that we can keep the core values that can help guide the practice, that can help guide the work, and that the whole thing just doesn't kind of spin off into kind of gets atomized in that kind of space of conflict?
Yeah, thank you. I'm smiling because it was almost like you knew where my thoughts were going as I was listening there. Yeah, and really, again, to build on what I've just heard and from where you left off there, Bob, to answer that, and it answers your question, James, it's that structural power that we see organisationally, institutionally. We have to also remember that that lives in the room. When all these stakeholders come together, that lives in the room with us, embodied in us and through us. So, for example, when I sit in a room with a group, let's use an example, this happens in anywhere that I work, but let's use an example in Sri Lanka. I come into the room and although my skin might be brown, of course I come with my Northern European white privilege. I come with English as my first language. I come with all the certificates and qualifications that make my knowledge more valid than the knowledge of the other people in the room. And straight away, there is a power disparity in how we're going to engage together. So you're absolutely right, James, these questions of how are we going to engage together? My job is to be able to smell, I need to be able to sniff out and smell and see and taste what power is happening in the room. And my job is to be the facilitator to try and reveal that and facilitate around the equity of how we show up in the room together. And part of that for me is about rehumanizing. How do we rehumanize ourselves to each other? There's clearly a sense of, let's talk sort of, I'm using generic terms here, but the idea of the poor brown people that need us to go and help to do research and give answers and then come in with our operations and our activities. There's already a sense of who's more human than others. It just generally as an ethos in this kind of international working. And then when we're actually in the room together, we have all sorts of enemy images about each other. And when I say enemy images, they might even be positive enemy images, by which I mean I show up in the room and suddenly somebody else minimizes themselves and their experience and their knowledge to defer to mine because mine apparently is more valuable. What that means is there's a division in the way that we can connect together. So there are many different processes and practices that I use in my work and that many people use over the world. I would be very reluctant to say that these are the answers. Rather, I would like to say that, we're constantly evolving new things and prototyping them from what we know doesn't work. So my offering is, let's see what people are prototyping in other spaces and see how we can make it relevant and ours in our context, and evolve that in this context. And for me, part of that is definitely about how we hold conversations together. For me, there's something really important about moving away from the debating for who is right and what is right. And I'm not saying that there isn't a place for that in the world. I'm not saying there isn't a place for that kind of conversation in the world. But if we're really going to step up to what's being called for right now, I really believe we're being called to have conversations together where we can courageously ask each other, what is it like to be you? What is it like to be you? How do you experience this? How do you experience me? And I need to have the skills and capacities to listen to your experience, not just listen to whether I agree or not, or whether it's right or not, or whether it fits my understanding of the world. And there are many examples of ways of dialoguing and having conversations that aim to do that. Which is exciting to say. There are things that we can put our hands on and experiment with.
I mean, that is tremendously exciting, and it's also kind of frightening. I mean, I mean, in some respects, we don't just need to change academics, but I think we might need to change academic culture. So this is a question I'm going to come to you next with, Paul. We need to support and empower academics to do these new activities I think in many instances academia just doesn't do very well, certainly in terms of science, where we get hammered into incredibly narrow little individuals and become specialists in our very, very narrow fields. If we're lucky enough to have a very, very long and illustrious career, somebody like Bob, we end up being able to span multiple disciplines and engage with multiple stakeholders. But in terms of a traditional academic progression, certainly in the UK higher education context, the route that's most traveled is a very narrow canalizing kind of one, in which we're almost like scared from trying to do some of this much more transformative work. I mean, one reason that I'm hoping we're going to get to in a moment is funding and the opportunities for us to be supported to do that, right? But Paul, what's been your experience of trying to extend not just your academic practice, but maybe even shift the institution in order to begin to address some of the challenges that Sarri's just kind of given us?
Well, the first thread is picking up on what people have already said, is that, I mean, like the co-production thing is really important, and we need new spaces for knowledge production, which cross institutional boundaries. Yeah, I think that's the key message here, that like we need, if we're going to go on this, if we've got this decade of transformation ahead of us, right, where we've got these converging emergencies, then we need new spaces for knowledge and action. And I think these kind of co-production labs, these urban labs, these place-based experiments, which bring together experts with lived experience on practical problems, rolling out solutions which are relevant to local and regional economies, is where it's at, right? So that's one part of the picture. It's new kinds of places. And there's round the edges, you can see them emerging. Loads of people are starting climate emergency centres. There's Civic Square in Birmingham. We're trying to set up this climate action centre in Leeds. I'm sure wherever you are in the world, you'd be like, oh, wow, something cool happening. What we need to do is capture some of the immense resources, power and talent of the universities into that enterprise. They used to do more of that stuff. What the universities have got muddled with and got shifted down is this kind of science property-led science park development model, right? Where what you need, if you're a university, you have a science park, and it's largely captured by large corporate industries who want to roll out big tech solutions, right? And I think those are part of the solution. But I think given the holistic nature of the crisis we're talking about, especially some of the stuff that Sarah's been saying, I mean, how do we start to do things like seriously decolonize global supply chains, right? To stop the harm being done across the planet. How do we start to build community-led wealth building strategies in places which can create local supply chains and good quality rather than precarious jobs? How can we start to think about what a car-free city looks like? So if you actually paid attention, I'm not saying anyone's not here on this call, but if we paid attention to the evidence that's coming out from the scientific community, when I read the IPCC reports, I just make a list of what you've got to do as an urban policymaker. And then I go to talk to the people in the Leeds City Council. Look, so we need to do A, B, and C, and I write a book about it. And like, crikey, I'm not sure we can do that. You know, car-free cities, nature recovery plans, community wealth building strategies, decolonising supply chains. All these things is what we need to do, and we need the university to be retrofitted. So we've got to retrofit the university because it's not going anywhere. Massive campuses. But we've also got to create those new kind of like citizen science spaces, right in the heart of cities, where there's a big public front door where people can engage with this stuff, acquire new knowledge, and roll out solutions that are applicable to them. But the key thing is the process behind it, isn't it? Right? The engagement and participation process. And it's not just that, it's an empowerment process, right? Because it's not just kind of like, we want diverse participating communities. We're trying to empower people who've been traditionally marginalised. And for me, it's not just about decolonising the curriculum, because there's a lot of that happening. It's a key point. There's two other key things. We've got to decolonise our methodologies, and we've got to decolonise our admissions processes in universities. Because unless we start to do those structural changes, all we're doing is changing reading lists, which is a nice start, but we've got to change power.
So in that context of changing power and the power of academic institutions, I certainly am a believer, a passionate believer. I think it's an article of faith now that academics can be a tremendous force for good. I mean, if you're thinking about the new thinking that's required for us to avoid the worst outcomes of the climate, social, and ecological crisis. I mean, if academia isn't generating that new knowledge and helping us to lead the way into a more sustainable future, then, you know, what is it for? What's the point if academia can't step up to that challenge and not do it in isolation? You know, work with a whole range of stakeholders, you know, in a truly deep kind of co-production context. But of course, there are tremendous forces which stop us from doing that, and we can't be naive about it, right? So the question to you, Bob, is, I mean, thinking about your experience of working in different academic and research institutions, what are some of the levers that we can pull to move them? So not just empower the individual academics or researchers that work in them, but actually get the organizations to maybe in some instances shift their focus, shift their vision, move the ambition.
Yeah, I mean, I've only been associated with one university, that was the University of East Anglia and the Tyndall Centre. And that is actually, I think, the sort of program that we need, where it's interdisciplinary research with a lot of linkages to sort of local cities, local people, and also to the government for getting government policies put together. So we all agree we have to do transdisciplinary research, but we've even got problem, and that's bringing in the other stakeholders for co-design, co-production. But we even have problem with making sure we can do good inter and multidisciplinary research. Why? The university structures are very siloed in most cases. Good universities have broken down some of those silos, and I think Exeter has some good work in it. But typically in the university, you have siloed departments, and in reality, you have to work right across the department. Secondly, the funding agencies, even the research institutes in England, they normally fund more disciplinary research than inter or multidisciplinary research. So we have to get the funding organizations to break down their barriers. And thirdly, most of the really high-class journals are also disciplinary specific. So there are structural issues in universities, in the funding agencies, and in the journals. And so we're seeing progress in all three areas, but not enough progress. And places like England, some universities and funding agencies in America are doing a moderately good job, but not everywhere. And in fact, in particular, just a very obvious comment, many of the challenges we face for a more equitable world are in developing countries. They need their own scientific community to sort of really work with their politicians, their private sector, and their citizens. And so one of the real big problems is a real lack of funding in most developing countries, except China, India, Brazil, Mexico, and South Africa. But you go beyond those countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and the amount of funding is minuscule. And yet we need to find mechanisms to improve the funding in developing countries, obviously collaborative projects, but you can't have a power asymmetry between those that maybe work at Harvard and those that work at a small institute, let's say in Nepal. So we have to think through how to get funding in developing countries and how can you put structures together where people are equal, and therefore working with local communities, indigenous people, especially for biodiversity, is absolutely crucial. And yet we have to respect indigenous communities and local communities and respect their knowledge. And there's a big learning process on how to work with indigenous peoples. Most scientists have got no clue, and most governments have got no limited clue. But it's crucial that we recognize this. And I'm often asked a question on the international, who is an expert? So when I say IPCC or IPBES or the AGASA are expert-led, it's anyone with relevant knowledge. It can be a local farmer that can hardly speak a word of English, but he understands the local context within which he's working. And so the definition of an expert is anyone with relevant knowledge. And what we have to do is learn what are the processes to make sure they can learn from our knowledge and we can learn from their knowledge as co-equal partners.
Okay, so in the light of that, from your perspective, Sarri, somebody who works with a very wide range of people, community stakeholders, you've got, I think, a growing, and I absolutely think it's the case, a growing cohort or community of academics who want to do something, right? You know, we understand the crisis, we're motivated to do something about the crisis. What, from your perspective and your experience, constitutes doing something useful, right? So one of the things I worry about as an academic is being a useful idiot. You know, I know lots of things. Is that really helpful? I mean, what can academics do to become meaningfully engaged in either co-production, co-creation, or maybe even just relatively small tweaks of their academic practice? What, in your experience, do you think has worked for some academics or some of the projects you've been involved in?
I think for me, something that's really effective is looking at a focus on impact rather than intention. And I link this to accountability processes. So we haven't mentioned accountability yet, but it's obviously a really important part. Who are we accountable to? Is it enough to decide for ourselves that we're doing well? And you know, that's for us across the board in every moment of what we do. And linking into this like transformed culture that we're aiming for me, that's about how do we keep us and what we're doing in right relationship with those who have the least power and voice and who are usually the people impacted the most. So again, that for me is processes of accountability as processes for connection, healing, and building community. No, we're not talking about punitive processes of accountability. And for me, focusing on what I call impact feedback is a really important way to do this. And it comes back to something like we create spaces, we call them, and we can use whatever language is appropriate, you know, whatever it feels right for the character of what we're doing. But one of the terms I use is that we talk about restorative circles. We create restorative circles where we sit down and we support people to hear how communities have been impacted by our research, by our projects, by our activities. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to harness the wisdom of any conflict, any tensions, any within the harms. There's what within any harms and negative impacts that have happened will reveal another layer that we need to attend to and build into our research, into our activities, into the way we do things. So for me, this is like building continual feedback loops of inclusion and of evolving systems, evolving processes for doing the work. It also builds relationships because we sit down to actually listen to each other, not to problem solve. The focus is on listening to how we are impacted from all the different places that we, locations and positions that we experience things. And it's not a competition that one location, of course, is not wrong, but one location of experience is incomplete. So we're coming into the room together to hear the whole, to use the elephant metaphor. I think this metaphor comes from Tibet, but I'm not absolutely clear on that. I would need to double check that source. The idea that there are three blind villagers, and one of them's holding onto this leg of this elephant and is saying that there's a tree, I've got a tree, and somebody's holding onto the tusk and saying, oh, I've got some kind of sword or weapon, and then there's somebody at the tail end who is saying, oh, actually it's a broom. You know, it's not that any one of those experiences or any one of those truths is wrong, but they're incomplete. So we come into the room actually longing to hear everybody else's truth and knowing that it gives us a bigger picture, and we build systems to integrate what we hear, the gold, the wisdom within that. And I use a phrase in my work: through you, through me, for us all. We come in with an understanding that we don't need to be defensive or protective about our truth, but we're really embracing it. And then we build systems when we've heard and we've gathered and we've harvested all that wisdom. We think about, right, what does that tell us on an interpersonal level about what we need to do differently? What does that tell us at a structural level? What practices, what policies, what procedures do we need to attend to? And what does that tell us at a cultural level? For me, when I use the word cultural level, I mean the assumptions and beliefs about how the world works that underlie what we're doing. So what does it tell us about our starting assumptions that may actually be unconscious and not revealed until we have these kinds of conversations? So for me, that's, as well as feedback systems for what I call living, evolving systems. For me, that's a really important part of accountability as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because it kind of, when Bob was talking about there are lots of different types of knowledge and knowledge holders, I think what you're doing is you're describing the process whereby we can incorporate and accommodate and work with that very, very different knowledge. I need to do a brief housekeeping and just ask audience members that if they have a question for the panel, please put it in the Q&A box. I've been asked to tell you all that because the chat discussion is getting very interesting, but we want to make sure that if and when you do have questions, that you put it in the Q&A chat box. And of those, we've got a question from the audience. It's Richard Rood, and his comment and question is, I don't think that the key lies in more research in the disciplines. This certainly talks about some of the discussions about transdisciplinarity already, but in how to use that research and knowledge. That's why 15 years ago, I left my traditional research and started working in knowledge usability. What Bob says about power structures is one of the keys, and it's critical to understand that the power structures are going to work to preserve themselves, right? So each problem is identifying barriers and negotiating to overcome those barriers and redistribute power. What expertise needs to be involved to make academic research usable? So, Paul.
I think more of us have got to work our way up through the institutions. You know, it's that long march through the institutions and getting into positions of power to transform power where it is. And look, I mean, to be honest, that we've got to reclaim the university and its power structures, and especially the research councils that go with it. Yeah. The current university development model is a busted flush. It really is. It's generating a generation of people who are massively indebted, who see themselves as consumers, and as a result have to participate in society and the economy in kind. Yeah. It's based on a over-leveraged land-based property development model, right? Which is pushing it toward building iconic white elephants all over the place, which have nothing to do with the solutions we're facing, although they can be retrofitted to do so. And they're massively over-leveraging this kind of faux globalization agenda, which is mainly pulling in high-paying international student cohorts to deliver high-yielding masters and taught postgraduate courses, right? Not necessarily in the areas that need taught. We need to get our own house in order. We need to get involved in university management. We need to take them on when it's not working. We need to radically decarbonize and get fossil fuels out of teaching and research, which is another biggie. And we need most universities to stop being union busters. Yeah, I mean, there's neoliberal management techniques which are now embedded at the heart of how universities work, and I think that won't get shifted without us getting in there and saying there's a different way to do that. And some of the stuff that Sarah's been talking about is like a new form of process as we reclaim the university. You know, there's thousands of us that work in universities. We know they're fantastic, right? Their campus is full of resources and people and knowledge. You know, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that process. So we desperately need it back at the service of society to save our skins in this decade of transformation.
Well, I think many people could get behind something like that. But Bob, I want to put a question to you because I'm not sure what point you're able to stay till today. Are we good for another 10-15 for you?
Yeah, 10-15.
10-15. Okay, we got a quarter of an hour of your time. So there's another audience member question that I want to put to you, is that they ask, what do you think of trying to change the definition of impact in official university policies? I mean, there's increasing interest in impact. We need to write impact case studies for our research assessments. Is that working? And if not, how can we make it a little bit more usable?
Yeah, I know that every 5 years in the UK, universities, I forget what the thing's called, but one of the questions is impact. When I was in DEFRA, and also when I was at the University of East Anglia, the way we looked at impact was it changing anything in society? Had it had effect on the ground? Could one demonstrate the research was actually being used to solve or contribute to solving the climate problem, the biodiversity problem, the pollution problem, etc. But it was very hard to show, because to do the causal chain between any one individual piece of research and a policy is close to impossible. And the reason is any policy or any government decision takes lots and lots of information into account, lots of evidence. So demonstrating your one project as a university academic, and it was your project that really made the difference on the ground, is difficult to do. But I was certainly involved in doing it for the University of East Anglia, trying to show how some of the research we'd done did directly affect a UK policy on the environment, either a policy or a strategy. And so I feel personally comfortable with trying to link research to what I call societal action, that it's influenced the government, it's influenced the private sector, or it's influenced a local community. Any one of those levels. But if you can show it's made a genuine difference on the ground, I think the problem is most academics overstate the impact of that particular one piece of research. But I think to me is impact. And I think this is the challenge we've got for funding agencies. As I've already said, we need to do more transdisciplinary research. Make sure we're doing the research that actually matters to an end user. But also most funding agents like to be at the blue sky end of research rather than the more applied end of research. So, for example, a very obvious question, one of thousands, could be, how do we actually have plants, agricultural plants, crops, that are more temperature tolerant, drought tolerant, salinity? But that's relatively applied. And many funding agencies around the world say, oh, that's boring research. But it's the relevance, it's highly relevant research versus some other blue sky. So we need to work with the funding agencies to make sure that they're funding things that really are important. I'm not against blue sky research. I think we always have to have a fair part of it, because you never know where tomorrow's discovery will actually come from. So I'm definitely not against it. But it's how do you get the balance between what I would call more blue sky research and more applied? There's a spectrum there. It's not one or the other. It's an interactive spectrum, actually, basically. So I think there are challenges of how do you write research programs to, say, institutes in the UK, where you say, I'm going to work with this set of local authorities. How much will that, how does that work? I know of some very good work at Exeter with Ian Bateman on greenhouse gases. And that is, in my opinion, the sort of project where he's working with literally all government agencies and farmers and foresters of, if you are going to reforest the UK, what is the right tree in the right place at the right time? And that is the type of research project, in my opinion, that we need to work on.
I'm going to bring in Jordan and Wolfgang now, because the next question, I think, speaks directly to some of the things we've just been discussing, but then also some of the issues and questions that we've been discussing, struggling with, trying to progress within Faculty for a Future. So the question is, and they preface it as devil's advocate, and I think this is just a generally really interesting question. It's if we come with our own frames of reference that are embedded in Global North models that are insufficient, is co-production the right way of looking at it? Should we be humble enough to know when we should shut up and listen to others, and maybe facilitate and amplify their voices but not co-produce? Are we sure others want to co-produce? So Jordan, thoughts on that?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant question. And I think I have multiple answers to that. I think on one level, in short, the answer is yes. There does need to be a hell of a lot more than that, more of that, of shutting up and listening. At the same time, at Faculty for a Future, our focus is on research and the role that research is playing, because I think the other side to that question is, well, okay, then should all research just stop? And of course, we don't want that to be the case either. And so then if you say, well, okay, research is going to continue, what research should we be doing? And I think then you can start to have a conversation about, within that frame, how should it be happening? And I think, we're of the opinion that most research, really, and much more research than maybe you might initially think, just going about your daily business, most research does impact communities. And so I think there's a few starting points of things to recognize from our perspective. And indeed, part of this event is really about stress testing where we're coming from. So I really invite reflections from attendees and panelists. We're here to try and do something that's useful. And as James says, this is by far the trickiest space that we've got running at Faculty for a Future. It's incredibly difficult. But I think we have a few starting points to just start to sketch out maybe a bit more of a clear vision that people can start to unite around. First one is, of course, the recognition that we're in these interlocking environmental and social crises. they're still advancing and they're causing harm, right, in the face of our best efforts to date. So what does that mean then? Well, I think it means that we need to think further about how we're doing research and who we're including. At the same time, I think it's really important for all researchers to recognize that academic research is just one form of knowledge among many. And so that means that, yeah, there needs to be a lot less emphasis, I think, on academic research as the be all and end all in transformation. But at the same time, and also, of course, to recognize that actually academia, through marginalizing other forms of knowledge, but by not shutting up, has actually contributed to harm. It's furthered and perpetuated harmful systems. And a lot of the time it can result in an approach that solves one problem by causing others. I mean, you just have to look at what's happening in the IPCC, where you have these models to get to net zero, to stay within 1.5 degrees, and they require an area of forest for bioenergy, carbon capture and storage that's up to twice the size of India. You know, where's that land coming from, and what are the consequences of that land being taken? You know, it's already resulting in land grabs, threats to you know, the fundamental security of the lives and livelihoods of people who are already living on land, right? So it's really important to recognize that academia has been contributing to harm, but I think also to understand that at the same time, you know, academia and academic research can use the privileged position of influence that it has still in society for good, to contribute positively. And I think for us, what we see as a standard to be aiming for the majority of academic research is to be combining different types of expertise. I think there are questions in the chat that are really brilliant and highlight that no one person has all of the necessary expertise required to do research that can make a positive impact. I think there's a need for if relevant, technical expertise, but then there needs to be more conversations between people who have that technical expertise, especially in that modeling space, and the people who have expertise in transformation, expertise in obstacles to action, expertise in how that technical knowledge and research will be used by others or not used. And then also experiential expertise from people who are really on the ground in the crisis. They're seeing crises from an integrated manner and can engage in conversations to actually understand, well, when particular assumptions behind research will result in harm, will be perpetuating harmful systems. And I think for me, we talk about what is co-production. For me, co-production is conversation, right? And it needs to be happening right from the start, because if you have a conversation halfway into a research project, it's already too late. And so I think and Philip is right. There's no one size fits all approach here, both in terms of how that conversation happens and also what kind of transformation are we aiming for. There's loads and loads of ways that you can go about it. You can focus on policy, you can focus on bottom-up transformation, the amazing work that Shibaji's doing. You can even focus on culture change. But just to have a really clear idea of what is it that you're aiming to do with your research and how can it actually result in change. And that comes from having somebody who is a practitioner, somebody who understands how change is manifesting on the ground, somebody who can facilitate bottom-up transformation, somebody who understands the policy landscape, right? Depends on what you're trying to achieve, but to be able to come together, have difficult conversations, lean into cultural differences, lean into differences in motivation, and also appreciate those differences, appreciate the difficulties involved in having those conversations, but trying to then arrive at a proposal before you even get into the whole, funding question, just a proposal for research that everybody in that room is happy with and that benefits all. And we've got some ideas about how we can start to do that, because it's all well and good having these conversations, right? But how are you actually going to make it happen? But I have already been talking for quite a while, so I'm going to stop there and pause and I would love to hear reflections from others on that.
Thank you, Jordan. Yeah, once you get going, you are a wonderful sight to behold. Well, I think that's a pretty good example of some of we're generating a lot of stuff and we're having lots and lots of discussions. And when we find people who share our interests and I wouldn't even say vision, it's like you want to monopolize them at the party, get them in a corner and never let them escape. But I want to try and bring Wolfgang in here. Now, Wolfgang, he's left academia. He also appears to have left civilization because his camera doesn't work anymore. He's in a tent somewhere. But I think you're joining us by telephone. Wolfgang, can you hear us?
No, it's actually 4G network.
Okay.
I'm in a desert actually. It's a kind of experiment here going.
Okay, right. So what?
It's in Europe.
Okay, maybe that's not so exotic. So I've got a question for you. I've got a question about. I mean, there's lots of positivity, I think, at the moment. And you know, Jordan just outlined some really, really important things that's following on from some of the discussions that we had with Shibaji, Philippa, and Erica. But I want to know about some of the obstacles that maybe you've experienced, or obstacles that you see elsewhere in academia, and what's your current thinking about how we as a project Faculty for a Future might be able to get round some of those obstacles, or empower academics to get around some of these obstacles? Because these are fine words and it's very exciting, but obviously we need to connect it to actual practice. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and you know, it's a bit in the way that John is saying. When you do co-produced research, you have to start at the beginning. It's kind of on the upper level. It's the same. We have to start from the beginning here in this project, seeing the potential obstacles, and that is vast. And personally, I think what we're dealing with is a vast sort of almost educational project, basically to change hearts and mindsets in academia. So I think it's almost impossible to enumerate all the types of obstacles we could face. I think I would rather sort of address as the fundamental issues. For example, a culture of kind of lonely fighter in academia. So basically, even if you're part of a research group, then it's usually the group leader who's got his or name at the end of the publication or whatever, however that's dealt with, and it's the publication records of that person usually that counts. And I think academics in general are terrible co-producers. I think, you know, I'm as a former academic learning how to co-work with the team here, which I already see is quite different from work in academia. So everybody has, you know, his or her own area, and you don't think, okay, no, I should be expertise in that too because I'm this great academic. So, and that's very much a cultural problem in academia. But that's not all. I think sort of, okay, what we want is we have this crisis. We do research. I've been hearing from the panel that why do you want to do co-production? And there's like two main arguments: is justice and relevance. I would say. So that's all good on that level. But I would actually like to zoom out a little bit more and sort of ask a question: is, I mean, why are we here? I mean, why don't we just put out the web service so everybody sort of announces a kind of, you know, social media thing, sort of so I want to co-produce with that and that person, or that kind of expertise, and just put it out there. People will find each other, and then it's done. And then we can go home, you know, as a faculty for future. And that's probably not possible because there's so many obstacles, and there are sort of, as I was saying, is a difference in culture. There are different, you know, there's power dynamics, as we all talked about. There are difference in the way people network, all these, and you know, like even ideas about what knowledge is and what our goals are. And the answer, sort of the way I see it, the answer to that is, let's first think about our vision. Let's first think what is our vision for the future of humanity, sort of think really, really big. And we've discussed that a lot, the fact of the future. I mean, that's basically, we want a fairer world. We want to pull together humanity and not divide up and then sort of even worse in the crisis. And the answer then is that co-produced research should be a model for that. and that, first of all, that means listening, building a culture of trust, and then, and very importantly, learn to value diversity, which is a very big step from the normal way academia works. It's like about big egos, and basically get people end up feeling there is a community going on, so which is a very strong feeling in human beings, but is being detrained once you enter academic training. So even for the student level, basically what the educational system does is detrain you from seeing the value in the community and diversity. So basically we're swimming against the current, I think. So this is a really big obstacle in my view, but I think it's very natural for human beings to feel very happy about community, and we want to create this feeling of community, and also that was one of the reasons why I wanted to have this webinar format in this kind of more sort of discussion format rather than speaker question, and so I think so that's a kind of like wrap up the answer. So there are very big cultural problems, they're very big justice and inequality problems, and we swim around against the current, but we want basically to embody the change we want to achieve in whatever we do.
Many thanks, Wolfgang. So yes, Philippa.
Yeah, just to respond a little bit, I haven't met Wolfgang, so I don't want to, sort of overlay something on your message that we haven't talked about. But I think there's a lot of reasons to be really positive about this. I think, there are huge barriers, but you need a theory of change. Okay, you're pushing towards a fairer world, but you've got to think, well, what action can we take from where we are here that will, we're not talking about, this small group of people changing the way the world works. That's not the thing. It's to see how your action fits within that bigger picture, but to do what you're actually able to do. And I think what we do have within academia is a huge number of people that are doing really interesting practice, that want to connect with other people who are doing that, and who feel that they want to make a meaningful contribution to the challenges that we find ourselves in, and are open to learning about that. So that's an incredible resource to tap into, to network and to mobilize. And in the same way that Extinction Rebellion in its early phases at least tapped into a very widespread feeling that we just can't go on like this and we need to somehow take the power back. I think the movement has changed quite a lot. There's a possibility of mass mobilization in that, and mass mobilization within academia. But I think you really find a lot of warmth and a lot of resonance for these ways of thinking, and that networking people effectively so that they don't feel like they are the lone academic that cares about this, and that people feel that they can talk about the emotional side of their work, the struggles that they have, the ways that they resource themselves, the connections that they have, because I think as Wolfgang said, research is a massively human pursuit, and in the end you work with people that you like, that people introduce you to. We work through networks, so it's all about kind of creating that mycelium, if you like, in a very it's a very popular contemporary metaphor, but that network that we can all belong to. So yeah,
that's so important. Yeah. And Erica.
Yeah, maybe just to pick up on a few things that other people have said and a couple of the questions. I mean, there was another devil's advocate question in there about how research that isn't convenient is just ignored. The pointing out the Climate Assembly that came up with similar views from representative populations is ignored. And I think, that's very true. And we need to sort of consider whether it's possible to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. If academia produces results that are convenient, then they'll be taken up as justification. And if it produces results that are inconvenient, they're going to be ignored. So sort of where do we sit within that ecosystem? And then the other question about how do we bring people in without making them think it's impossible and giving up? I think this comes back to what Shibaji was saying about reversing the gaze, that co-production can turn the tables in a way. We're saying we have our Western privileged academic view of these subjects of research, and we can turn the tables and say, well, what is the view from another standpoint? But also, I think when you turn the gaze also turns back on you. I think it's really interesting to look at what is the viewpoint from there of academia and research itself. What are we helping? Are we not helping? Are we making things actively worse? And considering, that's something that I'd really like to see, is more, not just reflection on the research, but also on the way that the research is done and who's doing it. Do we, in fact, as somebody else said, need to step back and shut up? I would be interested in understanding what the feedback is from marginalized communities as to whether it would be more useful for us as Western academics to step back and shut up, or to somehow try to leverage our position to make things better, but in the knowledge that this sort of neoliberal system is going to ignore results that are inconvenient. Does it just make us feel better to be doing research that is nicely co-produced, and we're sitting in our corner writing our lovely papers about how nice it is to do this and that and the other, and actually it's just getting ignored because it's not convenient for the wider system? And then what are the points of leverage to actually make it mean something? And as Philippa was saying, a theory of change for how this actually, in the knowledge of the way that the system exists, how this gets through to actual change.
Yeah, I mean, if you only have a hammer, the world is full of nails. Flavor the metaphor. Wolfgang was talking about academia, the institution, the culture is extremely good at hammering out diversity and narrowing your perspective, making you an expert on practically nothing. Whereas what we must have is plurality of views and a much richer understanding of what it is, maybe even what the problem is, right? So Shibaji, what I want to ask you then is, what would help in terms of academic practice? Because one of our really important motivations or our aims is to try to get academics involved in, we're using the expression co-production, but to get them meaningfully involved in the crisis, however we want to define it. And that could be in co-produced research, or it could be in trying to do more institutional change, do some of the heavy lifting of dragging institutions into a much more practical, effective space. So from your perspective and the projects that you've worked on, what would be useful? What would be a helpful route for academics to take at this point?
Yeah, one of the things that academics always think is the primacy of academia, and in whatever stuff they do. So if as Wolfgang was also saying, it's about community. So it's also about alliances, and also about transformative alliances where, it should be between hybrid actors, like local communities, like NGOs, scientists, state agencies who are sympathetic towards the cause, and then the academia. So it will also perhaps come out with sound alternatives based on, plural understandings of what transformation actually entails.
Okay, many thanks. Okay, so I'm going to bring Jordan in here now, and because we've been discussing a lot of the problem framing and some perspectives, and this is our research launch event, so I think we should hear from Jordan about what the plan is. So what's our modest contribution, Jordan? What is it that we're hoping to do?
The plan, yeah. Well, first thing to say is that the plan is a provisional plan, and we really are trying to manifest what we're talking about by co-producing to the degree that we can. And so I'm going to say this at the end, but I'm also going to say it right now. If you want to get involved in shaping the development of what we're doing, head to our website and sign up. There's a clear call to action there to shape the development of what we're doing, and we'll be looking to involve you, regularly over the coming months. But here's where we're at based on the listening that we've done so far. So, and I just want to pick up first of all on something that Erica said about co-production and whether it's something that ultimately maybe just makes us feel good. And for me, that's why you need both co-production and a transformation focus. And we are swimming against the current, as Wolfgang says, but I also really want to emphasize that the more people that swim, the more that current changes. And certainly from the conversations that I've been having over the last few months, I think that there are more and more people that are realizing that we can't go on as we are. And the institutions are always slower to catch up. But there are a lot of people that want to make change, and there are doors opening. And I think even in the funder space, which ultimately is the biggest obstacle, right? You can't do this if you don't have money. Even there, I think there are commitments, at least, to co-production and transdisciplinarity that aren't necessarily yet being met in criteria that actually have a meaningful impact on what research gets funded. But the door is starting to creak open. And so what do we want to do then in light of that? Well, we want to create a space for people who are starting to question the way that they're doing research, wanting to depart from research as usual, whether it's modeling, adaptation work, conflict research, political polarization, social media, all of these things are relevant to the trajectory of our crisis. How can we fix this if we can't even agree on what truth is, for example, right? But understanding that no one person has all of the expertise to understand how to do research that is technical, if relevant, co-produced, and can contribute to real-world transformation. We understand that this is difficult, but what we want to do is create a community that acknowledges the differences between different stakeholders, the difficulties involved in bridging them, but appreciates and values our diversity and our differences and feels united by a shared motivation to learn and to explore together. And picking up on a question that was raised earlier, what if people don't want to get involved in academia? That's totally fine. Some people won't want to, and different people will place their energies in different places, and some academics won't feel comfortable doing co-produced research, and that's okay too. But from our work, we can see that many within and outside of academia do feel these desires to lean into this challenge to depart from research as usual. But I think now we get to this kind of central issue that's blocking a lot of transformation from within research. Because if it was just as simple as saying, oh, well, we need to do this, let's just do it then, right? But these collaborations aren't happening as much as they could and should be. And I think the simple reason, Wolfgang alluded to it, is that it takes time and effort to build trust and to find a configuration of research that works. And we think that in this environment of overwork, everyone in academia is overworked, everyone outside of academia is overworked. There's also these funding constraints, right, that I spoke about before, and this issue of differing privilege, unequal power dynamics. There's not enough support that exists to foster these new connections, to build the trust, and to co-design research proposals that benefit all. So what we are aiming to do over the next few years is to develop a funded service that actively tries to help diverse stakeholders build this trust, and to co-design grant proposals that harness more traditional alternative funding sources that are dominated by the global north for research that is inclusive and transformative. And the idea here is that, as well as providing necessary time and space for trusting connections to develop, that this would be seen as early stage funding that could help sweeten the deal when then later applying for research grants. So essentially it'd be seen as co-funding by grant making bodies. And I'm really interested in our panelists' reflections on that, whether they think that fundamentally is something that has mileage. And if it is, then what we want to do is to really take this slowly, right? We can't pretend to just be able to go and fix this in a couple of weeks. It's going to take a lot of work. But we want to stress test this vision that we've outlined, and those of you that would get involved to shape the development of what we're doing, that will be the first ask, right? Is for us to be able to sketch this out in greater detail and provide an opportunity for feedback, and then go about the business of really trying to learn more about the interests and the values and the desires of the people who share the vision that we arrive at. What collaborations are you interested in? I think one of the things that we've really struggled with the complexity of this space is that there's so many different research areas. There's so many different ways for people to come together. There's so many different ways in which transformation can be sought. And if we decide that we're going to focus in on one particular area, then you end up sort of inadvertently advocating for one particular approach, and I don't think there is one right answer here. And B, you end up being relevant to such a small research community that maybe it's not maybe the best use of time and energy. And there are already great researchers out there doing, here's how you can get involved in co-production in this particular context, in that particular context. And, on one level, a question of what can an individual academic do is to just go online and see for your area of research, how are people recommending that you go about things, and see whether that resonates with you. But the approach that we want to take is a broader one, to just try and do as much outreach to as many different people inside and outside academia as possible, understand what their research interests are, how they want to see research develop, the expertise that they have, the expertise that they're looking for, the values that they have, the values in others that they're looking for, to try and facilitate collaborations where we already see alignment. We can do that from our position. But then also to make this crucial step of saying, okay, you're interested in this vision, we're trying to make it happen. What is it that you would value in a trust building service were we to be able to develop one, right? Because we want this to be really guided by the needs of our community. And one of the questions I would love to explore with the panelists is, do you think that there are some commonalities in terms of a recipe for success in co-creation, in co-production, whether it's an expert facilitator who has a particular set of expertise or a particular set of tools. And then when we get a critical mass of people that are inputting their interests, their desires, and also contributing to the development of this future funded trust building service, we want to make a searchable community publicly available for people to start to see if there are others that share their interests and that maybe match the expertise that they're looking for. And then alongside that, what we're trying to do before we can even develop a funded trust building service is to put out there, collate what practical support already exists out there to support this community who are starting to try and think about, well, how can I refocus the way that I'm doing my research? So that's whether that's tools for trust building. There are plenty that exist out there, and sometimes it's just knowing that they exist and finding one that you think works. Tools to help you understand the different routes to transformation and what expertise is needed to realize them. And also advice for framing grant proposals, because I think a lot of this is, yes, okay, a lot of the funding isn't geared that way, but also part of it is in actually being able to communicate the value of it and finding through co-production a space that goes, okay, well, I as an academic can still do the thing that sadly is what governs my career progression, being able to write a paper, but also alongside that, we're going to do this thing that's going to directly benefit a local community. We're going to do this thing that has, a potentially proven route to actually having some meaningful influence in a policy space, for example. And then the final bit is to put together and actively maintain a list of lesser known and unconventional funders that may support this kind of co-produced transformational work, particularly leaning on the philanthropic research funding space, which is one that many academics see as a minefield, and that's because it really is a minefield. But for us to be able to have a relationship with funders that are interested in funding co-produced research, and then to be able to bring that to our community of academics, that's something that we really want to do. And so final remarks, we want this to be an open space that anyone can get involved in, but I also want to be really upfront that we're going to be trying to do active outreach in some among key communities that we think need to be more active, put more active effort into being included in the conversation, particularly those that haven't had such privileged access to research funding, and to go to them and say, are you up for this journey? If not, then that's totally fine. But if you are, what is the research that you want to be seen done? What is the expertise and the people that you would like to collaborate with? And then we can go and actually try and find academics who could also engage in that journey. So there's an awful lot there, and I'm aware of the ambition contained within it, but I would really appreciate reflections from all of our panelists and indeed attendees on what you think resonates with you, and how we can improve our offering.
Thanks, Jordan. That does sound wildly ambitious, but you know, that was only really a tiny thing of the thing that we began to discuss. I mean, when we first started this project, we had this idea, and it grew and grew and grew, and it's really, really exciting. Because when you think about the wild claims or objectives of somehow shifting academia, yes, the sector, institutions, it begins, you know, it's just like pulling a piece of string. The whole, you end up in so many different places. And so I think it's certainly to Wolfgang and Jordan's credit and the rest of the team that have been able to produce something actually, I think, coherent and achievable given the timescales and the resources that we've got. Well, I think so. But this, in our concluding section of the event today, we're really keen to just get your initial reflections on that vision, some of those objectives. And I say that being mindful of time, that so we've got 5 minutes left in terms of our scheduled programming. It's not a disaster if we overrun, but maybe if I could just ask you all to contribute, maybe just some initial thoughts, and also advice or perspectives. You know, are there things that we should be doing? Are there things that maybe we shouldn't? Are there people that we should be talking to? Just any kind of reflections you might have. So who should we go to first? Philippa, how do you fancy tackling that? It's my turn to say you're on mute, and it wasn't me this time.
It wasn't you, no, thank you. Yeah, that there is a broad agenda there, and I guess I just offer a few thoughts. I think you know, academic careers are long, I guess, and once you start to shift the way that somebody sees their research, that will hopefully stay with them over a long period of time, and it will also infuse the people that they train, the people that they collaborate with. So in a sense, you know, I think sort of intervening in that tiny window that people have between when a request for proposals comes out and the grant deadline lands is quite a tricky time, because people are stressed and they're trying to do a lot of stuff in that time, and they're liaising with their finance department. I'm doing this at the moment, so it's all very fresh. But I think you want to think more about how can we shape the long-term trajectory of somebody's career such that they start to take these things into account, that they get familiar with their own networks, as Jordan said, that they're familiar with the resources that support their kind of community in doing co-produced research. They're exposed to events where they hear about the value of it. They're able to build the skills that they need in order to do this effectively. So yeah, I think that there's a good reason to sort of try and intervene in very sort of sharp ways at the moment where something is being decided, but there's also that kind of long, slow drip, 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 which in a way is how the impact and the public engagement agendas that I've been involved in have shaped research over the last sort of 10, 15 years. So I guess, yeah, don't be disheartened, you know, if you can't make all of those kind of really sharp, massive interventions. Also be happy with a slower, longer term thing.
Yeah, that's so important. Was it Max Planck who said science advances one funeral at a time? I think that's not what we want, right? We want a much more dynamic and fast moving approach to change. Shibaji, what are your thoughts?
Yes, I was thinking about how you know, the academic initiatives also, we are talking about long degree, but at the same time how a certain philosophy can be scaled up and out, and it need not be, you know, immediate and big bang, but transdisciplinary, you know, co-production can be one way to go about it. And yes, that's what is coming to my mind at this point.
I mean, do you think our kind of aims are realistic or practical? I mean, how much confidence do you think we're going to get? Maybe not all the way there, but at least a significant fraction of the way there. Yeah,
there is also a, you know, politics of research aid. That's also, I was thinking, you know, on the back of my mind. But at the same time, the trend, as you had said earlier, is to, you know, come together and co-produce and find new ways of looking at transformation, understanding transformation. I think it is an approach, and it is also important. It's, you're not talking about just the, the northern gaze, but also it is about bringing all together, and even if it's baby steps, but it's something in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you. And Erica?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think Jordan's right that the door is opening for funding in this area and these directions. So I think it feels realistic to be targeting, opening those doors, pushing, finding the gap and getting your foot in. The vision is very large, and I suppose I would say don't, keeping that large scale vision, don't be afraid to focus on specific things and have a flagship program, even while the other stuff is still there on the back burner. Yes, it might feel unbalanced, but the only way that you're going to get more people in is by having some evidence of success in some area. And so I wouldn't be frightened of going for a particular thing, even if it feels like you're neglecting other things that are also important. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, getting people together, like, this is really nice. It's lovely to have a chat with you all. I'd like to see more of this. It would be nice to see more faces, and get more people, find out more about what other people are doing, because academia is often quite a lonely place, and it's just nice to connect with other people who are sort of on the same page. So keep doing what you're doing, and let us know about it, be visible. It's a shame that there aren't 10 times as many people on this call. It would be great to see more interest, but I think the interest is out there if you can find how to get it to people. So yeah, it's early days, but scaling up, I think. Good luck.
And is that concept of co-funding something that you think is going to be useful and helpful? I mean, maybe Philippa, you might have some experience or thoughts on that as well. I mean, this notion of a co-funding model to somehow break out of the constraints of more traditional established funding models. Do you think that's got legs, that idea?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, whether it's quite co-funding, because if it comes before you get major research funding, then it would probably be like seed corn funding, or and I think there's lots of evidence, and certainly that's something that we used to do and they still do at Cabot, to fund small, co-produced projects and then hope that they scale up into something larger. I don't know, kind of. I'm just starting to navigate the world of philanthropic funding and how much is available, and kind of how closely funders' aims align with the same sorts of aims that research councils have. I think I would put a lot of pressure on UKRI to follow up on some of the funding schemes that they've had, like the Global Challenges Research Funding, which was money diverted from DFID at the time into UK research. They should be championing their own great practice in this area and really trying to move more resources into that direction, I think. And also the EU, I know it's a huge behemoth of an organisation to try and interact with, but I think they are way behind in the UK, even in terms of the way that they fund projects and what their expectations of how people share the knowledge that is generated from those projects. So I think there's an enormous amount of pushing that could happen there, and especially in the responsible research and innovation space. So, I would say, yes, it's good to try and find little pots of co-funding money, but I would also not ignore lobbying the big elephants and seeing if you can shift them.
Bob, how do you respond to Jordan's specific question at the end, but also just your responses or thoughts about that overall vision or objective?
No, I mean, I think what one was saying very soon, we want to empower academics to be outside the box, or at least explore the research that they find is most important. I need to reflect a bit more on what was said, to be honest, before giving a meaningful result. One thing that does concern me is that the key conclusion of the last two reports I helped to write or chaired, Making Peace with Nature and also the best global, unless we transform at the national global scale our economic structures and our financing, we're not going to ever succeed. Doesn't matter what you want to do. Doesn't matter if you want to conserve or restore biodiversity, whether you want to address climate change, mitigation or adaptation. And there's only a handful of people in the world that control that, finance ministers. And so if you to ask me, who would I go and see in any government, it wouldn't be the head of state. I would want to sit down with the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, the finance minister in France. If we can get rid of the subsidies and start to include natural capital and inclusive wealth in our decision making, it would revolutionize the way we actually look at environment and development issues. So one of the challenges, are we doing enough work to convince policymakers that the economic system needs a drastic reformulation? That's not to say we need to go away from capitalism, but we need a highly modified economic system. It doesn't matter how much natural science we do or social science. If we can't restructure the economic and financing system, we're not going to succeed. Now, the question is, in your program, what type of space would you need for that type of research, but also how to lobby and make sure that we're being listened to? And I think that is the challenge of how to get finance ministers and, of course, senior people in the private sector. I think the World Economic Forum is moving in the right direction in some ways. You may not like that format, but they are starting to recognize the importance of environment, climate, biodiversity, land degradation is a crucial issue for the sustainability of most companies. So I think the key question is not what sort of research we do, but how do we work with these powerful players from the global level to the city level. I mean, every level in between. And if we can get a cadre of scientists that spend a lot of their time working with decision makers, all types of, that could really make a difference. And also working with the media. The media can be our friend or our enemy. We need to cultivate really good relationships with our journalists beyond, in England, beyond the Guardian. It really, I mean, the Guardian does a great job, in my opinion, most but we need to get the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Mirror, and the other, the Times, all of them to be putting pressure on the public, on the governments, and on the private sector. So I think the issue of communications is really going to be a crucial issue.
Okay, many thanks. So Bob, you responded to the challenges that Jordan presented with a whole set of other challenges.
Exactly, I know.
Challenges. And I'm going to come to Paul and then Sarri in turn about that.
And I'm going to disappear, so I need to go.
Okay. All right, many thanks, Bob. Take care. I just want to say, in the context of communications and writing and journalism, my environment column for the iNewspaper will be out on Friday, and I've been writing for newspapers for best part of a decade now, and it is extraordinarily frustrating to get really important and useful and constructive environment, climate news and editorial actual published. It's still the case that editors have this kind of incredibly narrow view. Jordan used to be an editor at The Conversation, and he was one of the tiny fraction that get it, but he ended up moving away from journalism. So what does that tell us?
And we are working on that as well, aren't we, James?
That's also one of the objectives and aspirations for Faculty for Future. Okay, so Paul, right? You actually started the discussion today all about power. I mean, you gave it a name, you called it neoliberalism, and you talked about the relationship between academia and power. And now at the end, Bob has been speaking about the fundamental challenges, or the response to some of the challenges that Jordan introduced or was discussing, and that we hope to be able to address through Faculty of Future, is all about power, right? So what is the regular Joe and Jane of academia meant to make of all of this? How can we empower academics to get engaged about power? What is the gateway drug that we need to introduce to get more academics involved in this space and in this discussion?
Well, I mean, it's quite a heavily individualized profession, isn't it? But I think scratch below the surface we're very collegiate, and I think test, learn, and experiment, right? I think is what we're trying to do here with this kind of initiative. Yeah, you know, over the years in geography, it's been a great example. You know, just to say some of the highlights from geography and what the disciplines can learn, and we've learned from other disciplines. I mean, public scholarships become a really big thing over the last 15 years. You know, and we've brought that in as public geographers. What does it mean to be a public geographer? You know, critical scholars, scholar activists. I wrote a paper about being a scholar activist with one foot in the academy, one foot in civil society. So I think just dipping your toe in the water. So lots of us teach modules. You know, how could you tweak a lecture? Then how could you tweak your module? Then how could you rename your module? Or how could you get together with a bunch of colleagues and introduce a new module? You know, we've on this wonderful kind of history of radical and critical geography over the decades with Antipode and different journals, wonderful work of David Harvey, Bell Hooks, Cindy Katz and others. It's like, how do you develop this kind of model of an institution beyond the academy, institutions without walls? Yeah, start to like do field work, introduce field work in your class, start to learn from lived experience, bring that into your teaching. Yeah, how do you start to then spin off little kind of like little guides from your research and think about what that co-production means for putting a bid together? I mean, the co-production thing is really big at the moment. There are loads of opportunities to do co-produced work. It has been captured a little bit like participation was captured in the kind of 90s and noughties, in the sense it's become the new kind of zeitgeisty word. So we've got to repoliticize it with a small p, yeah, because it's an opportunity. It has been kind of captured. As long as you're doing co-production, you can do it with anyone on anything, yeah. And I think, you know, so co-production is a methodology which is quite neutral, but it's got to be focused on that disrupting power, yeah. So that's the kind of thing, you know, like if there's not a conversation about decolonization going on in your department, start one. If there's not a strong union in your workplace, safely start one. You know, so there's loads of things that we can do as academics to change our workplaces for the better. Teaching, research, admin, right, all across all those things. The bigger thing I'd say, the exciting thing about the Faculty of the Future is we need, I think we need a really good theory of change. I think what we're hearing from Bob is what happens is that there's loads of money for basic science on climate, yeah, or ecology, loads of it, and then we get all these understandings, you know, moderately neutral scientific understandings. What then kicks in is this kind of very heavily politicized now culture war interface, right? And therefore, where the money lands after that understanding is deeply modified. And what we need to do is create mechanisms through which we can then create a theory of change about where that money gets spent. Because what happens is basic science understands the climate change, solution equals big tech, big science, yeah? Not geared towards system change. And I think what we need to start to do is say, actually, we need to recapture where that money lands in terms of solutions. So the big science is important. It's that interface into where it lands in terms of solutions-based work is what I'm really interested in, yeah? And that is the hard work of getting on committees, research councils, all that kind of stuff, yeah? Influencing colleagues are already there. And then supporting junior colleagues, amplifying their voices, showing allyship with people who have those good ideas at the grassroots, yeah?
Yeah, these are all really exciting, but they're also quite almost threatening. I mean, one motivation to become an academic is because you want to live in your little ivory tower. And the last thing I want to do is get involved in power and politics, because it's kind of, I think it's for two reasons. One, it means you're working directly in conflict. You might be having to convince people, argue with people, get people to behave differently or to think differently. And also it means addressing the crisis in a much more immediate way. And I think many of us are still pretty good at denial, right? I think many of us are still quite frankly scared about the future that we see. Some of the future that we see, we can divine through our own research. And so, we've nearly run out of time actually. So Sarri, maybe this might be the last word, or at least the last question, is how can we keep open this space of realism and, but also a kind of grounded hope, given that there is such potential conflict, given there are such potential fears about the future? What can we learn from maybe some of your work and practice?
I'm loving where we got to. I'm really clear that what is being called of us and asked of us now is to be courageous. We need to move from safe spaces to courageous spaces. So yes, it's scary, but that's what's being asked of us now. How do we create courageous spaces? And we need to do that not in isolation. We need to do that in solidarity, and we need to do the personal reflexivity of where are we ready for? You know, if we're not the one that's going to start the conversation about decolonizing in our university or get the union conversation begun, then we might be the one that can be a support and an ally to the people that can do that. So we need to find our place, but we need to be ready. We need to build our muscles for being in courageous discomfort. And I really believe that this could be what Faculty for Future really is doing. If we want to build muscles for holding dilemmas, more complex dilemmas together, more than just trying to find silver bullet answers. If we want to build the muscles for holding multiple social truths together, if we want to build the muscles for being able to be in difference and divergence and find the wisdom in that, if we want to be, build all these new muscles that we've been talking about today and more, we need to build a gym to do that muscle building in, because the gym that we've built, the way that we organize on this planet, builds muscles for a domination system. It doesn't build muscles for anti-oppression and for transformative, co-liberatory ways of being and doing. So the Faculty for Futures is building a gym. And now we want to identify what are those muscles then that we really need to start building. And we can still be going one step at a time with what we're already doing, but we can start to be bringing in the new kettlebells or the new, ropes or what. You can hear I never go to a gym. I don't even know what I'm talking about in terms of gym equipment. And the only other thing I want to add to that is being ready to suspend what we know, and also being ready to look in the cracks, because quite often the transformative stuff emerges around the edges of what we're really focusing on and in the cracks. So I'm just kind of throwing that one in there as an extra thing at the end. Yeah, we're focusing on this, and what's happening around the edges might be actually where the fruits are growing, perhaps the most fertile, actually. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. That feels suitably empowering. I feel stronger just listening to that. I think we might have time for just one last question, actually. I think no one's going to tell me we don't, right? So we've got. I think it's best if I just read it out. So to one of Paul's earlier points, some of us have engaged the university with some guarded success to commit to explore decarbonisation of campus operations. I often find that's the kind of gateway. People want to, reduce the impacts of their own institutions. And this person says, I would tremendously benefit from being able to connect with others through Faculty for Future and put together a blueprint of ways to decarbonise Scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. Solutions will, of course, depend on location, but general solutions surely apply to many campuses. Actually, whilst you're here, Wolfgang, this seems to be pretty much one of our objectives or things that we would like to do, right?
Well, actually, as we were saying, there's so many ways of changing, and one of the things we also want to do is platform people, of course, who are already leading these kind of initiatives. I've actually been talking to one of them, is Adam Aaron, who's actually doing this exact same thing in University of San Diego, University of California, San Diego, and basically by platforming all these good initiatives, create a sense of community. That was what I was saying before. That is actually quite normal to do this. without everybody having to do this job. I mean, not everybody has to do this initiative and talking to the power structure of the university, to talking to the power structures outside, talking to the affected communities. It's a lot of work. So we want to platform all the great things that we're doing, and so this community building, I think is a central thing, as well as a gym. I mean, gym is also community, isn't it?
No, I really like the gym analogy now. I'm going to work with that because there's lots of different machines that works lots of different muscle groups, right? And we've all got a role to play. And I think in the past I've made the mistake of trying to, not that my ego was big enough that I think I could solve everything, but somehow you've got to find the most important thing. And often that means you don't really do anything, because then you just get bewildered by the complexity, or just overawed by just how large the problem is. Whereas maybe in the first instance, we just do need to connect to each other, listen to what each other are talking about, get a bit more immersed in the challenges of which are multifaceted, and just begin to pull the weight, right? Just begin to lift it or move it, or whatever else you do in the gym. But I think they're the analogies end, and they're also the event, because we are now out of time. So thank you very much, Bob, who had to leave early, and Sarri and Paul for your time and your wonderful engagement today. I do feel better now. So I mean, that's a success. I feel better about things now than I did about 90 minutes ago. So thank you so much for your time, your enthusiasm, and also all that you do. And please continue to do all that you do, because you are, in some respects, the role models, the people that we would aspire to be. So thank you for leading the way. Thanks so much, Jordan and Wolfgang, for your comments and your contributions, and helping us understand a little bit better what Faculty for a Future hopes to do in a research context. Well, that was this week. Next week, we're talking about engagement. So from 9 a.m. and at 5 p.m. next Tuesday, the 19th of July, we will be launching the Engagement Hub, which is all going to be about communications, impact, engagement. And we have another set of stellar stars for our panel discussion. Just to remind you again, please do connect with us on Twitter at faculty_future. If you're going to hashtag it, use Research for Future, and visit facultyforafuture.org. If there's one thing that you haven't done, then just do that. Visit our website, click join, and then learn a little bit more about how you can get engaged. You can sign up to mailing lists and become part of our journey. So thank you again, our panelists. Thank you again, the audience members, and all your wonderful questions. And thanks everyone for what has been, at least for me, a really inspirational event. Thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your days.